That said, oh, perfect. Got the notification. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Money Talks in Oakland, New Insights and Solutions, a panel and webinar that will explore the out of balance campaign finance system here in Oakland and the depth of big donors' influence on Oakland elections. We'll also explore some possible solutions that empower regular folks like you and I here in the city of Oakland, including democracy dollars. My name is Jose Del Rio, and I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Money and Politics Program Manager for California Common Cause. But that said, before we get started, I wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping, create a little bit of space in recognition that the city of Oakland is a diverse, creative, tough city with a history of empowering people from all walks of life. We will be offering live translation in Cantonese and Spanish. So to access these translations, and again, this will be said in Cantonese and Spanish momentarily, but to access these translations, in the meeting webinar controls at the bottom of your screen, please find the icon that looks like a globe and click it. Once you have found the language that you prefer, Spanish or Cantonese or English, select it, and then finally click the mute original audio button. And then after that, you can find the actual translated versions of our slides in Cantonese and Spanish in the chat. Right now, I'd like to create some space for the Spanish translator to go ahead and give this notice in Spanish. Go ahead. Perfect. Perfect. And I'd also like to, oh, I'm seeing there's some technical difficulties with the Spanish room. Okay, perfect. So if you want to listen to this in Spanish, please join the Spanish room using the instructions that I laid out a little bit earlier. As we will have interpretation. Oh, and before I jump, I would also like to invite the Cantonese interpreter to give that instruction. Perfect. I think that should have been successful. Well, thank you so much to everybody. As we will have interpretation throughout the entire program, I would just like to remind all our panelists and all our speakers to speak slowly, not only to ensure accurate information, but to also allow folks to process the information being shared here today. And finally, to our audience, as we go through our programming, please feel free to drop your questions into chat. Our moderators will be collecting them, and we will have a dedicated question and answer period featuring all of our great panelists at the very end of our presentation. In the meantime, please feel free to drop your name. I see some folks already doing it, your organization, your affiliation, and your pronouns into chat, and interact with our moderators. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So before we begin, here's a little bit about our coalition, Fair Elections Oakland. Fair Elections Oakland is a coalition of various community groups who came together to harness the energy and expertise of the many groups working to reform the campaign finance system in the Bay Area. Our coalition includes Oakland Rising, the American Civil Liberties Union of NorCal, Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, Bay Rising, California Common Cause, the League of Women Voters Oakland, and of course, Maplight. Our mission as Fair Elections Oakland is to advance local election reform and small dollar public financing as a tool to empower politically underrepresented communities here in the city of Oakland. For now, we're focused on democracy dollars and other fair elections reforms as tools to boost the power of small donors and enable local candidates to run viable campaigns without wealthy outside backers. So to that end, Oakland has a long legacy of organizing communities for power. And we have another opportunity to show the rest of the country how we build a real local democracy. That means a local government where every voice counts, with representatives that represent Oakland. Our coalition solutions, including democracy dollars, enable Oakland elected officials to make real connections consistently and do the work they were elected to do, make Oaklanders' lives better. So before we begin with our full panel and programming, I wanted to do a little bit of a trivia game with the audience. So we want to hear from you. We want to test your knowledge about the state of money in Oakland, the state of money in Oakland politics. So let's play a round of trivia, 2 questions, very simple. Momentarily, you will see a multiple choice box appear on your screen with the following question. Who was the biggest donor to Oakland Unified School Board elections in 2016? Perfect. And if somebody can let me know in chat if they cannot see. It's perfect. I see some bouncing around. Awesome. It looks like we have a pretty good sample size at this point. So I am going to end the poll. And we should share the results. So absolutely correct. I love that this group knew that. So former NYC mayor, presidential candidate, non-Oaklander, and billionaire Michael Bloomberg was absolutely the biggest contributor to OUSD races in 2020. I said 2016, didn't I? So one more question. Who was the biggest donor to Which Oakland City Council district had the most individual donors in 2016? Go ahead and vote now. It's District 7, District 1, or District 4. I see some bouncing around between District 1, District 4, District 7 is coming up a little bit more. Perfect. I think we have a good sample size there. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. We're almost at a tie with District 1 and District 4. But the correct answer is Oakland City Council District 1. So as we move through our programming, please make sure to keep these answers and these poll questions in mind, as they will make a little sense. They will make more sense as we go through. Perfect. So with that, let's go ahead and begin. So I'm really excited for today's panel. Today, you'll learn from local money and politics experts who will detail the state of campaign finance in Oakland. You'll hear from Dan Newman, president and co-founder of Maplight. You'll hear from sitting Seattle City Council member Teresa Mosqueda. You'll hear from our very own Liz Suck, who's the executive director of Oakland Rising. And of course, I will be here along the way to help facilitate the conversation and keep us moving forward. So perfect. We'll go ahead and jump right in and jump to our first panelist, Dan Newman. So our first panelist is a national expert on government accountability and money in politics. He's president and co-founder of Maplight, a nonpartisan nonprofit that promotes transparency and political reform. And he's earned multiple awards, including the Knight Batten Award for Innovations in Journalism, a James Madison Freedom of Information Award, and has been a featured panelist on various media outlets. Dan has also, through Maplight, has also recently completed and successfully completed establishing a public funding campaign in the city just north of us in Berkeley, California. So today he will discuss the findings of his latest report, Campaign Cash, the outsized role of money in Oakland elections. So if everybody could please drop a W into chat and welcome Dan Newman. Dan, take it away.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and excited that today we released Maplight's report on campaign finance in Oakland. And so I'm going to be going through pretty quickly today with some highlights of the report. The full report is available on the Fair Elections Oakland website now, with even a lot more detail than I present here. What we did in this report, we looked past at the last 8 years of Oakland political spending and looked at what the patterns show us about this money and politics data, this campaign finance data. We looked at questions like, how much money is there in Oakland elections? Who's giving the money? Where are those people from? What are their demographics? Who's receiving the money? How much money is coming from high dollar versus small donor dollars, and so on. So let's go on to the next slide. We found that money in Oakland candidate elections rose to its highest level in 8 years during the last election, the 2020 election. So in 2020, candidates raised $2.6 million in direct fundraising and $2.4 million by outside groups. So outside groups is money that's spent independently of candidate campaigns. Now there are 8 organizations just in Oakland, just for influencing Oakland elections, 8 organizations and individuals gave at least $75,000 to these to groups seeking to influence candidate elections. So the number 1 on that list was mentioned earlier in the poll. Michael Bloomberg gave an astounding $920,000 over the last 8 years to influence Oakland elections. Lyft, the ride company, gave $439,000 in Oakland elections. So there's big money that is affecting Oakland and affecting the policies and laws in effect for Oakland residents. One of the things we found was that easy victories still attracted large donors. So during her re-election bid, Mayor Schaaf, who had an election that wasn't even close, she received more than twice as many votes as her nearest competitor. She received about $500,000 in her re-election bid, which is almost equal to the approximately $500,000 she received during her 2014 election. So the next slide. We looked at how did money make a difference? And we found that it did. So during this 8-year time period, out of the 31 races that were contested, 77% of them were won by the candidate that raised the most money. So big correlation between winning a competitive election and raising money. Next slide, please. There are 6 funding sources that candidates can tap into when they're raising money for their campaigns. There's companies, nonprofits, unions, political action committees, individual donors, and their personal funds. And we found that this interest beyond just individuals, we call them special interests here, were a substantial part of candidate fundraising. So contributions from corporations, nonprofits, unions, and trade associations, and PACs, so all these things that are not individuals, made up 13% of all candidates' funding. And of the candidates that won, it was 17%. So you may think of like campaign contributions coming from like individuals, and most of it does, but 17% of winning candidates came from these groups that want to that have an interest in what government does, and that's one of the ways that undue influence can seep in. Next slide, please. We also looked at where the money came from. So the so there was a lot of money that came from outside Oakland. So you can see in these charts, like looking at mayor, for example, half the money came from Oakland, but half of it came from outside Oakland, and even a substantial portions out of state as well. So there are the donors that don't even live in Oakland that are having substantial effect in funding Oakland political campaigns. Next slide, please. So we looked at who gives to these elections. So looking at the 2018 mayor election, for example, just 1,000 residents contributed $325,000, which is 40% of all the money raised by mayoral candidates. So you have these 1,000 people have really an outsized influence on campaign funding. Oakland, a city with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of residents, just 1,000 people gave 40% of all the money raised by mayoral candidates. Let's think for a moment about the candidates for Oakland School Board. Here you can, in the school board, you can really see the difference between the enormous number of constituents that the school board serves and the amount of donors. So the Oakland School District, it serves more than 38,000 students in Oakland. The Oakland School District has a staff of 5,000 people. And the number of people that gave $100 or more to Oakland School Board candidates is less than 500 each election. So less than 500 people, they contribute $100 or more to Oakland School Board restaurants, despite the fact that it serves 38,000 students. So this really brings home the disparity between the enormous number of people that Oakland city government serves and the tiny amount of people that are actually funding the election campaigns to elect the leaders that make the decisions about all of the people in Oakland. Next slide, please. So we divided up the donors into different categories. So, because individual donors, small donors, large donors, we handled it as small donors, individuals giving less than $100. We called medium donors those who contribute between $100 and the maximum amount, and then the large donors gave the maximum amount they could, and that's about $800. It varies a little bit depending on the election. So small donors, people giving under $100, which is what, if anyone's going to give money to elections, like that's, what people could afford the most, is the least amount of money. Only 6% of all candidate funding came from small donations. So when we talk about like individuals giving money to campaigns, like it's overwhelmingly people who give hundreds of dollars, like $800, $500, amounts over $100 is overwhelming amount of individual donations. And even if for candidates who have a substantial amount of individual donors at the small level, people that give $5, $25, it doesn't add up to very much in terms of candidate funding. Small donors gave only 6% of candidate funding. Now, if we want to make make things more, the funding match more the population, obviously there needs to be changes made so that like the small donors have more impact and the large donors and medium donors have less impact. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, let's go back to the previous slide. I forgot one moment. The people that giving $500 or more contributed 45% of all funds received by candidates. Okay, so I'm gonna repeat that for a sec. So nearly half of all fundraising came from people giving $500 or more. So, that is not me and the people I know that give that much amount of money to candidates. It's a small group of people, but they're contributing 45% of all funds received by candidates. So once again, this big disparity between the people of Oakland and the donors of Oakland, the donors of Oakland being a small, exclusive, wealthy group. So let's go on to talk about the zip codes, where the money comes from. So this slide and the next slide, in this slide, we're going to look at racial demographics by zip code. And the next one, we're going to look at income demographics by zip code. So on the left here, you see each bubble is one zip code, and you see them aligned by population. On the right, you see these bubbles addressed from who gave the most money. And so you can see that the zip codes that are labeled between 50 and 75% white residents, so those are the 3 zip codes that have the most white residents in the city, hugely disproportionate giving compared to their population. So those 3 majority white zip codes in Oakland gave 1.4 million to local candidates. So those 3 zip codes, majority white zip codes, represent 21% of the Oakland population, but they gave 45% of the money from Oakland residents. So 21% of the population, but those 3 zip codes gave 45% of the money. The 4 zip codes with less than 25% white residents, so those are the 4 bubbles in blue on each chart, they contain 40% of Oakland's population, but they gave just 16% of the money from Oakland. So the zip codes with the highest percentage of white residents overrepresented in terms of money. The zip codes with the lowest proportion of white residents underrepresented in terms of money when you compare it to their actual population. Let's look at the next slide, please. Looking at it by income, those same 3 zip codes with the greatest proportion of white residents also have the highest household median income in Oakland. So once again, those 3 zip codes, 45% of the money from Oakland residents while representing just 25% of the population. And then if you look at The 7 zip codes that have the lowest household median income, those are the blue bubbles here, less than $75,000. 60% of the Oakland population lives in those 6 zip codes, but they give just 33% of the money given by Oakland residents. So you have a real disparity between who is in the population and how much money that they give. Thank you, and I'll turn it back to you, Jose.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dan. I appreciate that presentation so much. Folks, what were some of the things that were most revealing and most telling about Dan's report? I saw a statistic a little bit earlier dropped in chat by, I believe, Emily, about people giving $500 or more contributed about 45% of all funds taken in by candidates. Wow, nearly half. That's incredible. That's and not in the good sense. But thank you so much, Dan. And now that we've heard from Dan, we'd love to hear from you. We want to hear what you think about money in politics, how it affects your daily life. I know we have folks from various organizations, members of the public, members of different areas of government. So we'd love to hear from you and sort of get your reactions to Dan's report. And of course, you can also read more of Dan's report in the links that were dropped in chat. I know one of our moderators will actually drop a link in chat right now. But for now, we'll go, oh, wrong direction, excuse me. For now, we'd like to hear from our next panelist. So our next panelist is one I'm very excited for. She's a current member of Seattle City Council, and her top priority is promoting healthy communities, lifting up working families, creating more affordable housing for all residents in Seattle. She works every day to build an economy that works for all and has dedicated her career to amplifying the voices of the most vulnerable in our communities. She was recently elected in 2017 for the first time to serve over 725,000 residents in Seattle as citywide council member in position 8. And importantly for this panel, during her run in 2017, she committed to only taking small dollar contributions and engaging new voters through a new program known as democracy vouchers, or democracy dollars as they're known here in Oakland. She now holds the distinction of being the first-time candidate in the nation to win using publicly financed campaign vouchers. So please welcome her in the chat, Seattle City Council member, Teresa Mosqueda.
Thank you so much, Jose. It's wonderful to be here with you. Actually, one of the first presentations I did after winning election for the first time in 2017 was join folks at BAPEC. I came to Oakland for a one-day conference with a number of folks who are on the line. I remember ACLU was there and so many other members of the coalition. So it's great to be back and literally just re-won my election in November of last year. So still within my first quarter of my second term, again, using democracy vouchers.
Yes, of course. And we remember that presentation so vividly. That's why we wanted to have you back. And congratulations on your recent win. Very well earned. But you talked about running for office, right? You talked about that sort of recent win. I know you mentioned democracy vouchers. I was wondering if you could give our audience a little bit of a breakdown on what democracy vouchers, or democracy dollars as we call them in Oakland, what they are, how they work in Seattle, and how they benefited you.
Wonderful. Well, again, thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's really exciting to be part of this esteemed panel. I had to run upstairs and grab my book by your first presenter. If you haven't read Unrig, the famous Daniel Newman is actually the author of Unrig, and I am featured in comic form, if you can believe it. Now that's a milestone in this book, because this is a summary of the democracy vouchers that were used here in Seattle. And democracy vouchers, as folks might know, we're part of a citizen-driven initiative. Citizens went out and collected signatures to put a measure on the ballot to make sure that we had an opportunity to diversify how candidates got elected, and diversify, I think, in 3 ways. One, they wanted to change the impact of big dollar donations going to fuel campaigns, and to really make sure that publicly financed campaigns were possible. Quite literally, we are mailed paper checks that say $25 on them, and we all get 4 of those checks. So each resident in Seattle gets $100 to donate to the candidate of their choice. If candidates pledged to take small dollar contributions. And for city council, for example, the maximum amount that I could receive in actual dollars was $250 in 2017. My last election was $300. So we're not talking thousands of dollars. We're not talking $800. We're talking about a maximum of $300. And importantly, if you pledge to that, then you're able to receive these democracy vouchers. I have the distinct honor of having the name of the first-time candidate to win using democracy vouchers, because in 2017, at the time, I was 37, a renter, like half of the population, 52% of Seattleites are renters. I know that the number is very high as well in Oakland, and we needed more renters on city council. We needed to continue to stand up and create a more diverse and representative democracy. At the time, the individual who was stepping down was in his 60s, older white gentleman, and we wanted to diversify who got into that seat. And I say we because this was a broader community effort as well. I worked with the Washington State Labor Council, AFL-CIO, community partners, immigrant and refugee organizations, and they were like, you should do it. And I think often, as folks probably know, candidates really take themselves out of the race before they even enter. They ask the question whether or not you can afford it. You know, do you have to fund this with your own deep pockets? I didn't have deep pockets. Actually, frankly, in a lot of women's suits, we don't even have pockets, but that's another conversation. And so a lot of folks in the community are like, you should do it. This is the first time democracy vouchers are available. And importantly, I wanted to do it in 2017 because it was just months after Trump won the election. And I think for a lot of our progressive cities and progressive states, a lot of voters felt really disheartened that their vote didn't count, that their voice wasn't being heard.
Absolutely.
And democracy vouchers allowed for that.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that summary of democracy vouchers. If we could, I just got a note from one of the interpreters, slow down for a second. I appreciate that. But that said, you know, I really love how you integrate your community into everything. You talked about being a union advocate. You talked about being a woman, a person of color. I know in previous instances, you talked about being Chicana, Latina, somebody from a community who isn't traditionally represented in local office. I'm wondering what obstacles coming from those communities did you face? And did public financing, specifically democracy vouchers, did it benefit you and remove those obstacles?
Yeah, I think the first obstacle was wondering how I was going to finance this, knowing that candidates before me, a lot of groundbreaking candidates, colleagues who were my friends and continue to be my friends, like former council president Lorena Gonzalez. She was elected 2 years before I was elected. She ended up refinancing her condo, and that just doesn't seem like a great message to candidates, that if they want to run for office, that they need to refinance if they have property. Knowing that I wasn't going to have to be in a position of wondering whether or not I could personally afford it was really a huge barrier that was removed. And also, I think an opportunity, right? This was an organizing opportunity for us to go into community and talk to neighbors and neighborhoods that hardly ever get their doorbell rung, and say to them, not only am I hoping to win with your support, but hey, have you received your democracy vouchers? Because they were mailed to you in January. There's these little envelopes that frankly, I myself, who was considering running in January, put in the recycling bin, and then 3 days later pulled back out of the sack because I realized it wasn't city news about recycling. It was city envelope with actual dollars inside of it. So we went out and talked to voters door to door in neighborhoods that had never had their doorbell rung, but it was an organizing opportunity for us to try to get more people involved in local democracy as well, and to educate them about the tool of democracy vouchers, in addition to showing that candidates like me wanted their support and wanted their vote, but also wanted more people engaged in local democracy.
Absolutely. More, I love that end note, engaged in local democracy, more people engaged in local democracy, because I think that's a beautiful way of saying that this program works. It's inclusive, it engages folks, but I know I'm preaching to the choir here. But you mentioned something I wanted to drill down on. You talked about this idea of knocking on doors, right? And going into those communities that sort of have been often kept out or left out of local politics. I'm wondering, now that we've had a couple of election cycles under our belt, you just talked about your recent win. Again, congratulations on that. Do you feel like the program is working? Do you feel like it's elevating those grassroots candidates and elevating those community voices?
I do. So I think that there's three questions that I would ask of publicly financed campaigns. One is, what are our goals? Is our goals to change who considers running for office, which we just talked about? And I think the answer to that is yes. When I first ran for office, there were 8 people who stood up and said, I want to run for office and I want to be a candidate in this year with democracy vouchers. Of the 8 of us, 7 were women, people of color, members of the LGBTQ community, and younger folks. That's an impressive improvement over the slate of candidates. The second question that I think we have to ask ourselves is, will it change who is engaged in donating to elections? And I think that's the question you just asked, is did it actually work? So let me just give you a few statistics. And I really, have folks who know me, I see Tiffany Mendoza on the line here. She knows that I love a pie chart.
Real quick, I'm sorry, council member, you need to slow down the interpretation.
Oh, sorry.
We're really having a hard time keeping up with you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I will do that, and I'll look for
your. Thank you.
I will look for your hand as well. Okay. I am notoriously a fast talker, so I'll slow down a little bit here. And it's a good thing too, because I want to share the numbers with folks. In 2013, the year that the campaign was really gearing up to try to convince voters that we wanted to change the process, there was 8,200 residents who donated to campaigns. Fast forward to when in 2017, residents could use democracy vouchers for the first time. 25,000 residents donated. That's a 3-fold increase in the number of people who donated to campaigns. And not only is that important for getting people engaged in their local democracy and elections, but it actually changed the dollar amounts that were given too, right? So in 2013, the actual size of a donation was over $200. And that was 2013, 2015, over $200. But when folks knew that they could offset actual dollar contributions with democracy vouchers, the average contribution went to around $80. Now, in my last election, so first of all, the first election, 3-fold increase in the number of people who donated. But the last election that we just had, and I just got the numbers from our department, 48,000 people had donated to campaigns. So twice the amount of residents donating from 4 years ago to last year. So on that second question, right, is it diversifying who is donating, and is it changing who stands up and runs for office? Absolutely.
You heard it here, folks. Heard it here first, folks. 48,000 people. That's incredible. I always say, if you want to convince me of something, show me numbers. And I don't think there's better numbers than 48,000 people. On that note, though, council member, I know our time is limited. I do want to jump to our next panelist before we bring you all together to have a sort of a conversation with our audience. So thank you so much for those statistics. Thank you so much for your perspective. We're extremely appreciative. We'll go ahead and jump to our next panelist. And with that, I'll go ahead and share my screen again. There we go. Perfect. Perfect. And if anyone's having issues seeing my screen, please let me know in chat. But that said, I mean, you heard it here first, folks. Now that we've heard from the council member about the successes of democracy vouchers and publicly financed campaigns in cities like Seattle, a city that's not too different from the city of Oakland, I'm wondering, what's the most surprising thing you've learned thus far? How do you feel about democracy dollars? How do you feel about democracy vouchers and publicly financed campaigns? I'm seeing a lot of positivity in chat, which I absolutely love. The Seattle system is great and empowering. Thank you so much, Rocky. But that said, keep the conversation going. As we do that, I am going to move us forward so that we can hear from our next panelist, who I'm very excited to introduce. Our next panelist is someone deeply rooted in East Oakland. She uses her passion for community building and social justice to build cooperative spaces that try to challenge the status quo. She has 25 plus year career in various nonprofit and grassroots organizations here in the Bay, and is committed to social and racial justice, as well as environmental justice, for Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities, and passing these values onto her 2 children. I know she'd want me to mention that, who you'll often see by her side. But that said, our next panelist is Executive Director of Oakland Rising and a member of Fair Elections Oakland, and somebody who is a good friend, Liz Suck. Thank you so much, Liz, for joining us today. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing so that we can have a conversation, you and I. You know, we just heard from Dan Newman talking about sort of the state of campaign finance and money in politics in Oakland and all the problems that we have, right? I mean, Lyft, Michael Bloomberg, a few other organizations, and a few other statistics that were pretty alarming. But I wanted to get the Oakland perspective, and who better to give the Oakland perspective than you? So you're the first person I thought of. So overall, I'm wondering, can you give me your thoughts? What do you think about what Councilmember Mosqueda was talking about with democracy dollars? What are your thoughts about that program? Do you think it's something that could be successful here in Oakland and empower local candidates and grassroots or small donors, excuse me?
You know, it's so funny that you mentioned my kids, Jose, because if they were here, they would be behind me, like talking about democracy dollars. They would probably jump in right now and tell you all how excited they actually are about it. Because when we talked about, you know, the 2020 elections, we talked about the 2018 elections, and we saw our OUSD school board very recently vote to close schools here in Oakland, public schools. And many of those who voted for it were backed and received campaign financing from outside of Oakland, and were supportive of, you know, supported by the types of Bloomberg, right? And I think as they were like, who let these people win? Like, how did they get here? Who's supporting these people? You know, they were confused about it. So, you know, it's such a nuanced thing talking about campaign financing, right? And it sounds like so out of our reach, and it's a little conceptually sometimes hard for people to understand. But when you get down to just those numbers, when you talk about that, and when we recently went through some redistricting work here in Oakland, and when we looked at where does the power actually lie in Oakland, right? And when campaign finance is, and I mean, campaign donations are so critical to that conversation. And so I'm really excited about democracy dollars. I'm really excited about what happened in Seattle. I mean, to go from the potential, I wrote it down, y'all, these are my notes. To go from like 1,000 donors, right, to 48,000 donors that are influencing the direction of this city is really exciting to me, because that 48,000 is not 48,000 that are living in the hills, but 48,000 who are living potentially in the flatlands of Oakland, right? Our poor, brown, Black, Indigenous communities, working class communities in the flatlands of Oakland. And I'm really excited about that possibility, because you know, when we do door knocking and canvassing and phone banking because nobody else does it, nobody calls. A lot of candidates don't door knock in the flatlands because they're the low propensity voters. But to also hear the statistic of then moving from having folks who like don't donate, don't vote, right, to then going from being donors to then being actively involved in the electoral process, like that's exciting to me. And I can't wait for that to come to Oakland.
Yeah, you said something, actually you said a few things that were really interesting to me. You talked about this idea of the flatlands, right, the flats, and how, you know, Dan detailed it a little bit earlier, how we have a sort of out of balance system, right? We have a system where a lot of folks are giving from the hills, but not from the flatlands, generally the areas where the Black, Indigenous, people of color, the working class, the renters, those communities. I'm wondering, you know, now that we've heard from the council member and Dan, do you think that a program like this is something that Oakland should really embrace, and something that could bring change to Oakland.
Yes, I mean, you just mentioning the folks in the flatlands not being able to donate, and I think, or not donating as
Right.
that's just a fact. And the reason why they're not donating, I think, is what's actually more important for us to talk about. Our communities,
Wi-Fi working for you?
Nope.
our communities in the flatlands are the ones who are most impacted by COVID, right? They're most impacted by economic downturn. They're most impacted by gentrification and displacement, right? So much of our population in the community has moved from, in Oakland we've moved from 2,000 unhoused folks to 8,000 unhoused folks in the past 5 years. And most of the 60% of those residents who are now living unsheltered are permanent residents of Oakland, right? And so when we talk about like, why aren't people donating? They gotta worry about rent. They gotta worry about bills. They gotta worry about public transportation costs. The cost of living has just gone up again. You know, like these are the reasons why people are not donating. And so when I think about the impact here in Oakland, right? When we have campaign, if we could have democracy dollars in Oakland, I think that this would change the way that candidates actually speak to folks, and how they organize and how they canvass in our communities and how they talk about their platforms and what kind of platform they're actually creating, right? And so that they would then begin to engage with those in the flatlands. And then I think we would also see an increased number of grassroots candidates, right? Folks who come from the communities that we're talking about. And that for me is really exciting, right? It's really exciting for Oakland to think about having people who are targeted to be pushed out of the conversation, right? Their ability to have electoral power in Oakland is specifically targeted to be left out, right? We hear from, candidate campaign consultants who talk about high propensity voters and big donors, and who are we talking to win elections, right?
Absolutely.
And that's who we need to go to. And we've always held the stance that actually the way you win in Oakland is by talking to Black, Indigenous, Brown communities, immigrant communities, right? That's where the power lies, because we are actually the largest population here in Oakland. And so to be able to move towards that, I think is going to be really critical. And I think that democracy dollars will be one of those steps to get us closer to that.
Absolutely. And I just want to drill down on that one fact. So you said two things that I found to be very interesting. The first is the talk of the unhoused population here in the city of Oakland. Something that we didn't get to discuss with the council members, that there is actually a candidate in Oakland during the 2017 cycle who ran, I know I'm preaching to the choir, who ran entirely on democracy vouchers that he received from the unhoused population. And that's what the beautiful, organizer snaps everywhere, because that's the beauty of this program, right? You don't need that initial fund or that initial discretionary money to run. You can be a renter, you can be from a working class community and solicit money from your partners, from your friends, from your neighbors. It sort of turns campaigning on its head, like you said, right?
Yeah, and I think that's what we really need. I think that we are in such a rut around what we think as the electoral process here in Oakland, and not just in Oakland, but across the country, right? We're not the only ones talking about doing this. Like Seattle was the lead on this, but there are many other cities that are trying to think about campaign finance differently, and trying to bring democracy dollars to their cities or to their counties, because we understand how critical money is to winning elections. And it's not only about winning elections, it's about then when you are elected, who are you accountable to, right? And, you know, we've gone through processes where we've, you know, I've talked to folks, you know, and they talk about, oh, well, I'll take this money, but, you know, I'm not held accountable to them. And it's like, you're accountable to them. You just took that money. They just bought you with that money, right? So, so I think that when we think about how do we build that power, not only in Oakland, but that we can collectively build towards something larger across this country, because at the federal level, we are being failed by our federal government, who continually pushes off a fair and equitable election process and voting rights, right? That this is one of those ways in which we can continue to push up against the system and really create a democracy that works for our people, the majority of our people, and here in Oakland and across this country.
Absolutely. And I see Kirsten dropping something in chat. She's saying, I love how Liz is tying all this together. This is about building power, not just here in Oakland, but everywhere. It's movement building to ensure that regular folks like you and I are part of the conversation and have our seat at the table when these policies are being designed. But I think that's a perfect segue into a question and answer. So we'll go ahead and bring back all our panelists: Dan Newman of Maplight, Seattle City Council member Teresa Mosqueda, and you, of course, Liz. Just to open it up to the audience, they've been patiently waiting their turn. I see some questions in chat, but I'm wondering if the moderators can do me a favor and help collect some of the older questions as well. I want to make sure that we address those as well. But I'll go ahead and start off with Kate M. So out of curiosity, why did money or donations rise so much recently? And what are some ways that we can get involved? So I guess that first part would be a question for Dan Newman of Maplight, and then I'll open it up to the entire panel.
Yeah, I don't actually have the answer on why. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Bergen Smith from Maplight, who is the who did the analysis and wrote this report. But I can say in terms of how to get involved, it's join the Fair Elections Oakland Coalition to do something about it. Bergen, do you have any thoughts about why spending increased?
Hi, yeah. Well, I don't claim to have a great handle on exactly the details of the recent races. I know that there is some particularly competitive city council races in particular in 2020, and that a lot of the rise in spending also came from large outside spenders in the school board races in 2020. I don't know exactly why that happened in 2020 specifically. I would need someone with a little bit more specific knowledge base of the candidates and the races to answer that.
Can I jump in and add something to that?
Absolutely.
That we saw in Oakland candidates who were beginning to, we have seen in Oakland, let me say this, we have seen in Oakland for many years, for decades, a very neoliberal agenda, right? And the neoliberal agenda is one where we bring more developers, we prioritize corporations and policing over our communities. And when you have candidates who come out and are saying like, you know, we want to refund the community, we want to tax corporations, we want to save housing for people so that we can save our people from being displaced and pushed out of Oakland, and that we want to curb gentrification. When you have that, corporations and big outside interests and money are going to pour in against those candidates. And that's what we saw. We saw that when candidates who were like, I will try to do whatever I can to curb corporate charters and their influence in Oakland, right? And then we saw, you know, that $150,000 drop by Bloomberg into a candidate's election, right, and into their campaign. So it's like, when you hear those things, when you hear candidates who say things like, we're going to ensure that housing is a human right in Oakland, then you start to see that money pour in a different direction. And so we have seen over the years what that has done to Oakland, and it has changed the face of Oakland in ways that we need to curb that now, and we need to stop that now.
I would jump in as well, and not to speak
Absolutely.
about the races in Oakland per se, but I mentioned there's 3 questions to ask. The first is, do democracy vouchers change who stands up and runs for election? Absolutely. I think we saw that in 2017. We saw that in 2019. We saw it in 2021. The second question is, does it change who donates? And I'm resisting showing a map of Seattle, but just envision Seattle with the north end and the south end being heavily populated by communities of color, who, if you look at the comparison in 2017, when the mayor's race was not taking democracy vouchers, but my race, which is citywide as well, was, you can see visibly who donated absolutely changed. Lower income workers, workers of color, communities that are more likely to rent. But the third question that we ask ourselves is, does it help get money out of politics? And that, I think, goes to the point that was just raised. We still have a broader campaign collectively at the national level for campaign finance reform to get money out of politics and to do some major reforms that other countries have as well, because just having democracy vouchers alone won't get money out of politics, right? People asked some questions in the chat about PACs. And in 2017, my race for city council was about $500,000, just about $450,000 over that. The race before mine for the same seat, about $450,000. So it didn't decrease the amount of money going into the race, but it changed who donated. That's important, but overall, we still have a lot of work to do at the national level to get money out of politics overall.
Absolutely. Very well said. Thank you so much to our panelists for that. I do want to say something. I think that last point was key, right? It changes who's giving. It empowers those small donors. It elevates those community members who, as Liz mentioned a little bit earlier, were kept out and left out of our current system. So your description of the northern part of Seattle reminds me very much of the flatlands here in Oakland, the communities of color, the working class communities, the renters. But with that said, we do have a few more questions for our panelists. This one is from Jan S. How are democracy dollars funded in Seattle? I'm wondering, council member, if you could speak to that a little bit. Otherwise, I can take that.
Yeah, happy to. And I saw someone reply in the chat as well. So as part of the 2015 democracy voucher initiative called Honest Elections Seattle, it was a 10-year levy. A 10-year levy that brings in about $3 million. This is on average at the time about $8 per property owner. Now it's upwards of $11 or $12, but that's for the entire year. And importantly, I think when we talk about redistribution of wealth, obviously not every property owner is wealthy, because we have a lot of folks who own property and are house rich now, since the average cost of a house in Seattle is $850,000. But what it did is it allowed for those democracy vouchers to get in the hands of all residents. And when I say residents, important in our democracy vouchers is that if you are a legal permanent resident or you are a citizen who's not eligible to vote, you are still eligible to receive democracy vouchers. Now we can streamline the process to get that into everybody's hands, because all registered voters do get immediately democracy vouchers, but other folks who are eligible for democracy vouchers, like legal permanent residents and citizens who are non-voting, are also eligible. So that property tax does get distributed to every resident and it makes it possible for everybody to get $100 to give to the candidate of their choice. Now we're gonna have to re-up that levy. I just was messaging folks at the Seattle Ethics and Election Commission, who are going to put out a report this week looking at our 2021 numbers. But we'll see how supportive voters will be for another levy. But it's been incredibly well used, and I think incredibly popular among voters.
Absolutely. And I think I saw in chat that it's funded by a 1% tax, which is one of the smallest taxes, I think, if I read that correctly, but important to highlight. The other thing I wanted to mention on that particular note, you talked about this sort of expansive base that democracy vouchers in Seattle has, right? In other words, you can contribute so long as you're an eligible resident, which is a little different, right? I'm going to go back to Liz on this one. I'm wondering, Liz, you know, we have a population here in Oakland that traditionally in the Flatlines, you know, doesn't contribute. Having such an expansive program like this, and this question is coming from chat, having an expansive program like this, do you think it'll expand the donor base here in Oakland?
Oh yeah, for sure, for
Good.
sure.
Yeah, me too.
I think that I think Seattle is a great example of that, but I think that it will shift where candidates begin to who they're talking to, right? Because now it will be about
Right.
power building as opposed to about just you know, money in their campaign, right? So that we're talking about putting the power back in the community as opposed to like just some nebulous beings that are out there that are continually giving to and contributing to our campaigns here in Oakland and
Sure.
influencing politics in here in Oakland. And so I think that Flatland folks will get it. They'll be like, hell yeah, I'll do this. Where do I give my money to? How do I do it? They'll want to know that. And I think that will be the exciting part about it, right? I think
Absolutely.
yeah, I'm excited about talking to some folks about it, to be able to say to folks, like, this is one way that you can step into this arena and influence the way we do things in Oakland.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good place to pause for now, because I do see we're coming up on time. But before I let this group go, I'm a organizer by trade and an organizer by heart as well. So I wanted folks to leave with this. You know, in a post-Citizens United world, the real problem isn't how much money is being spent by wealthy donors. There's unfortunately little we can do about that. But we can stop the voices and contributions of regular people from being drowned out by millions of dollars flooding our democracy. And to ensure that our democracy works for us, for regular folks, we need to bring democracy dollars and other public financing programs to Oakland as they're mechanisms that allow our neighbors, our community members to run in fair elections and it puts regular folks into our government, folks who look like us, speak like us, experience Oakland like us. And this will result in good policy changes as well. But like I said, I am an organizer by trade, and I am an organizer through and through. So I want to issue a call to action to everyone on this panel, our fellow neighbors and Oaklanders. Momentarily, in fact, you should see it on your screen now. You'll see a virtual commitment card in front of you. I'm asking this entire webinar, this entire group, to commit to an action to bring reforms to the city of Oakland, to empower regular folks to take charge in their government and to contribute so that they can have a voice at the table. So you can request a presentation for your organization, you can share a written or video testimonial, or you can even sign up to volunteer. Each of these actions are correlate to a link that is being dropped into chat. You can go ahead and click that link and take that action right now and contribute to Oakland and bringing fair elections to Oakland. In addition to that, I'd invite everybody to visit our website, fairelectionsoakland.org. And with that, I would love to thank each of our panelists. Thank you, Dan Newman of Maplight. Thank you, Seattle City Council Member Teresa Mosqueda. And thank you so much to Liz for your time. We appreciate you being here today. And most importantly, thanks to each of you, our neighbors in Oakland and across the nation. We appreciate you taking an hour out of your day to be with us. And on that, on behalf of Fair Elections Oakland, have a great afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.